What if I told you that a president who was elected fairly was somehow allowed to rewrite the Constitution legally, and at the same time that he gave food to the poor, he was able to dismantle a democracy? It wasn't Russia or China. In fact, it happened right here in our hemisphere. And here's the terrifying part. This exact playbook could work anywhere, including the United States. And in this video, we're going to discuss why democracies fail, the early warning signs, and the economic consequences. And regardless of your political views, it's important that you watch this video, because what happened in Venezuela could very well be playing out right here at home, but not in the way that you think. In order to understand what is going on here at home, we need to understand the historical context, because even though history doesn't always repeat, it often rhymes. And there are some modern day failures of democracy that are rhyming with what's happening in the United States right now. So let's start by talking about the rise of democracies, which is very much a modern day 20th century sort of phenomenon. But even though democracies have become the preferred or de facto political organization of Western countries, they seem to be backsliding, with nearly 75% of the global population living under autocracies, where, in other words, a small group or one individual is responsible for all of the decision making. And quite often these autocracies are established through the democratic process, a democratic process that ultimately leads to its own destruction. And there's no better example of this than Chavez in Venezuela. Once the wealthiest country in Latin America, it's now the poster child for why autocracies can lead to economic failure. And it's also the perfect case study for how democracies fail and the signs that we should be looking out for. And it all started when Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 with populist rhetoric. In other words, he said all the right things to the largest majority of the population to win their favor, telling them that he would do things like lower taxes and raise incomes and do all of the things that a populist president would do. Now, before you go and label the other side the bad guys here, it's important to note that a populist president doesn't need to be conservative or liberal. They can be either. What is more important to understand is that populist presidents are elected because of a divide within a country. It's not the populist presidents that create all the problems, although they eventually do. It's the divide within a nation that gives the populist presidents the opportunity to do exactly what Chavez did, which started by creating constitutional reforms that centered power within the executive. And his successor after Chavez's death, Maduro, went one step further and completely eliminated all checks and balances, which essentially nullified any sort of opposition to his rule. Now, it's important to understand that this is why the setup of the US government, with the president, the executive, Congress, which is the Senate and the House, and the judicial, which is the courts, is so important, because it provides the checks and balances that are designed to prevent something like what happened in Venezuela. But as you'll see in a second, the real fear should come when these checks and balances start to be dismantled. Because in 1999, Chavez rewrote the Constitution. He extended presidential terms and allowed re-elections, and he restructured the courts to allow court packing. So in other words, stacking the deck in favor of those who were in favor of Chavez. And he was able to do this through several different techniques. One, for example, was increasing the number of judges on the Supreme Court from 20 to 32. And by appointing an additional 12 judges, he was able to very easily tip the courts in his favor no matter what was being decided. And this caused the court to cease to act independently. So it eliminated the first and probably the most important check and balance. From there, he was able to neutralize the National Assembly. So in other words, what is known as Congress in the United States. And what's crazy about this whole thing is that the opposition boycott of the government actually gave Chavez full control, which allowed him to push through enabling laws that allowed him to pretty much decree powers on whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted, including himself. And this made the entire legislative process pretty much irrelevant, meaning that all the power was then held by a single individual. He then went on to gain complete control of the military. He got rid of any of the top brass who questioned his authority, and he used the military for domestic enforcement, in many cases pitting the military against local police. And this essentially created a situation where you had two options. You were either in favor of Chavez and socialism, or, well, you went to jail or died. And where it got worse, and this is in my mind the most important piece, is when he was able to silence the independent media, when he revoked licenses of critical outlets and created state-run propaganda networks and used media laws, the laws that typically are designed for freedom of speech in most democratic countries, to criminalize dissent. He then went on to nationalize key industries, oil, telecom. He imposed strict currency controls, which obviously led to a currency that eventually would be worth nothing. And if you even thought about dissenting or arguing or not following the rules, you were arrested. And in order to gain all this control, he used populism to build that loyalty. He funded massive social programs, which obviously led to people loving him, especially the majority who were impoverished already. And he demonized the elites and the private media, even though he was very much using his power to become even more elite and raise up the people around him. And he definitely demonized foreign powers, who were clearly not okay with what was happening in Venezuela. But when a leader is providing social programs and making your life easier, but at the same time also saying, and by the way, everyone who is saying mean things about me is lying, well, that makes it pretty easy for the people you're helping to believe you, whether the foreign powers and the independent media are right or wrong, because people almost always act in a way that is in their own self-interest. And if they are perceiving themselves to be better off than they were before, based on a populist leader, then of course they're going to favor that leader and listen to and believe anything that they say. But here's where it got really scary, is when they erased the electoral competition. Anybody who opposed the ruling party was banned, jailed, or otherwise disqualified from the elections. And the very people who ran the elections were loyalists of the ruling party, making the likelihood of fair elections almost non-existent. So these elections, the thing that democracy is based on, they gave the perception that the people had a choice, even though they didn't. And this led to a hollowing out of democracy, slowly. No war, no fights, no battles. There was a couple little ones, but never ones that were instigated by the government. But a complete and legal transfer of power without anybody realizing what was happening. And even though there was the perception that they were still a democracy, this transformed Venezuela into a de facto autocracy. And Venezuela isn't the only place that this has happened. Russia, from 1999 to the present, has undergone pretty much the same thing. Putin came to power in 1999, democratically elected, and he gradually silenced the media. He eliminated his competition, and in 2020 changed the constitutional rules to allow him to run until, well, he pretty much couldn't run anymore. In fact, by the time that Putin is done running Russia, he will likely either be dead or very close to it. Not because somebody has killed him, but because he's simply aged out. Turkey went through something similar, although in their case, they used a coup to justify massive purges, and then in 2017, did a constitutional rearrangement that essentially created a super presidency. And much like Venezuela, when a country shifts from a democracy to an autocracy, well, things economically don't end up well. Even though the autocrats will have people believe that what they're doing is in the best interest of everybody, it almost always leads to complete and utter economic catastrophe. And it did this in Venezuela, it did this in Russia, and it did this in Turkey. And it's almost always the same story. There's economic hardship, in the same way that there was in Germany after World War I, which allowed the rise of the Nazis. Hitler was able to legally transition to a dictatorship via the Enabling Act. And this goes to show that the patterns are always the same. When things get tough economically, populist presidents, populist leaders can rise up and change the game without anybody realizing what they're doing. But nowadays, things don't happen the way that they used to. It used to be that democracies failed through military coups. But today, the failures of democracies, they sneak up on you. They're done through the use of elections and constitutional changes and the dismantling of checks and balances. Because as opposed to violent takeovers, when you use the legal tools that you were elected to protect, you can transition power a lot more peacefully and oftentimes without anybody realizing that you're doing it, which is why it's so important to pay attention. Because the old way, the military coups, the violent revolutions, the sudden leadership changes, and the suspension of constitutional and civil rights, those aren't the tools that are used anymore. Today, it's the gradual erosion of norms and institutions, leaders using economic mechanisms to entrench power, and subtle and legal processes rather than dramatic takeovers. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, oh my God, this is exactly what Trump is doing, well, hold on a second, because this has been playing out on the other side as well. In fact, the divide that is happening in the US between the Democrats and the Republicans could set the stage for either party to elect a populist president that dismantles democracy, which is why it's so important to know the signs and to also have these parties work as one, as Americans, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as one individual country, one individual nation that may have differences of opinions on certain things, but ultimately that works together, not against each other. And it's also equally important for the parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, to make sure that there isn't a president that is elected that is going to be a populist type autocratic president. In fact, as much as Congress, the executive, and the judiciary are checks and balances for the total government, the parties themselves need to act as checks and balances for who is allowed to run. Because if this doesn't happen, it leads to the failure of democracies. So let's talk about why these democracies fail. So the common catalysts of collapse are economic crisis, shaking public trust. We've had 2 of those in the last 20 years. Then you see things like corruption and institutional decay rear their ugly head, which allows populist leaders to exploit these grievances. Oh, you're poor? Well, let me fix that for you. Oh, you got screwed because of this? Well, let me fix that for you. Oh, you don't like the way things are? Well, let me fix that for you. And the problem really begins when a populist claims to represent the real people. This is where a president, who's often elite in their own right, undermines the elites, the institutions, and the norms. And they do everything that they can to centralize power in a single charismatic leader. Then they set about eroding judicial independence. They do things like pack the courts with loyalists who are going to rule on things in their favor. And this political loyalty is prioritized over the legal expertise, which undermines the rule of law and removes the checks on the executive, meaning that they are able to get away with more than they should be able to, as they subvert the very checks and balances that were designed to make it so that they couldn't. Then, as it was done in Venezuela, there's the attack on the press. Oftentimes, media outlets are taken over by the state itself or by loyalists of the president, and independent journalists are often jailed or exiled, which leads to the media landscape being propaganda-driven, oftentimes without a country even realizing that it has happened. Then the electoral system is completely hauled over. Districts are redrawn, voting rules are changed. Certain opposition parties or candidates are not allowed to run, which is why during the 2024 presidential election, it was so important that states were required to allow Donald Trump to actually run in the election. Because not allowing him to run is the exact same thing that led to a country like Venezuela failing. And then again, where it gets really scary is when the checks and balances are dismantled. Parliament or Congress, in the case of the US, is weakened or bypassed. Rule by decree becomes normalized without any sort of conversations around whether or not the things that are being done are actually a good idea. And term limits are abolished or extended, which it's kind of scary that this is being talked about in the US. Then you've got the suppression of civil society. NGO laws restrict funding and activity. Universities and academic institutions are targeted, places like, Harvard. And protesters are criminalized, and dissent is suppressed. Maybe even those protesters are deported or not allowed to continue their education. Sound familiar? But then the surprises, the things that often happen out of the blue, become the thing that is weaponized. Natural disasters, coups, pandemics. And temporary powers, the ones that are designed for emergencies, are made permanent, which suppresses civil liberties under emergency law. Then comes the full court press, personality cults, and strongman politics. Leaders are idolized in state media and education. I don't want to go out on a limb here, but many of the things that Fox News is saying about President Trump are so ridiculous that they border on the line of idolizing a false prophet. Then comes the discrediting of critics and intellectuals. And when loyalty to the leader takes over from loyalty to country, that's when we know we have a real problem. That's when a democracy is about to fail. And all of this is essentially the authoritarian playbook. The step-by-step erosion of democratic institutions, the use of legality to mask authoritarian intent, and the centralization of power across branches of government. One person gets to make all the decisions, And I'm going to tell you right now that it's never in the best interest of a country for one individual to be making all the decisions. This is how democracies fail. This is how currencies fail. And this is how people who elect a populist government get a lot poorer a lot faster than they ever thought possible. So now with all that said, let's talk about the economic consequences of a democratic failure, because this is where things get really scary. And this is how it affects your individual pocketbook. So it's important to understand that democracy correlates with long-term economic health. Countries that are ruled by majority rule tend to do better because the ability for one individual to screw the whole thing up is essentially nullified. But authoritarianism often leads to mismanagement, as those who are in the know and those who are smart enough to know that something is a bad idea lose the ability to convince the autocratic rulers to pump the brakes. And as a result of the mismanagement, institutional weakness leads to a complete loss of investor confidence, which is often why countries will demand repayment of loans when they see things going downhill in a country where they've invested, which is what typically leads to a run on the banks and a complete collapse in a currency, as we've seen in both Venezuela and Turkey. And not only that, it leads to severe economic consequences. In Venezuela, the holder of the single largest reserves of oil in the world, GDP fell by over 75% since 2014. Now, keep in mind that 2014 was one of the lows in the price of oil, meaning that oil has pretty much gone up in value since then, and Venezuela's economy should be significantly better off, but it's not. And this subsequently led to hyperinflation of 130,000%, if that's correct, in 2018. And by the way, this is real hyperinflation, where the cost of goods are almost doubling on a daily basis. That's what hyperinflation is. It's not when you see 10 or 12% inflation. That's not hyperinflation. This is real hyperinflation. And over 7 million people as a result fled the country. Many of them, some of them at least, finding their way into the United States, looking for greener pastures. Turkey had a similar currency crisis. And when they cut interest rates, this defied all economic logic. Inflation exceeded 80% in 2022, leading to a massive loss of the lira's value against the US dollar. Then there was the stagnation and sanctions in Russia, where their growth slowed to nearly zero by the 2010s, and Western sanctions isolated key industries, which ultimately, it could be argued, led Russia to invade multiple other countries, including Ukraine. And they had this long-term stagnation despite having significant energy exports, which again is another clear sign that a really wealthy country can become very unwealthy very quickly when democracy fails. Then this all leads to investment and brain drain. No smart individuals who have the ability to move elsewhere and earn an income are going to want to live in a country that's run by a single individual. Educated citizens often see the writing on the wall, the failures that are about to happen, and immigrate for other opportunities in other countries. And then with legal and political uncertainty, capital also flows out of the country, as investors look for safer places to put their money. And I can't emphasize enough how dangerous this is for the US right now, because the US's economy is largely driven by debt at this moment. And if investors in other countries were to move their money elsewhere, well, guess what? The gravy train stops. And this ultimately would lead to an economic future that would be completely hollowed out. Not only would things get bad, but the chances of recovery would go to almost zero. And without the ability to borrow money, the debt situation would just become way worse. Interest rates would be all over the map. They would be completely volatile, and populist spending would increase inflation risk. In some cases, even as much as what happened in Venezuela and Turkey. And this would lead to credit ratings being downgraded, which means interest rates would have to be higher in order to attract investments. And that just leads to a whole economic mess that also leads to political instability. So the economic price of losing the democracy is that democratic erosion reduces long-term growth. Inflation, corruption, and capital flight end up following, and economic pain reinforces the authoritarian grip, which just creates this feedback loop that makes things worse and worse and worse. So what are the warning signs? What should we be watching for before the inevitable happens? Well, it's really simple. First, you need to understand that democracies die gradually, not suddenly. The warning signs are almost always visible before the collapse, and early recognition is key to prevention. because we definitely don't want to see the US go from being the greatest country in the world to being an economic catastrophe overnight without anybody noticing. We need to watch out for legal attacks on institutions, rewriting constitutions or laws for power, undermining independent courts and agencies, which, by the way, is happening right now as judges are being arrested, and where legal changes are framed as reforms, where there is essentially no need for a change to the rule, but the rule is changed in order to make things better, and in many cases, often fix something that isn't actually broken. Then we need to keep an eye out for media control and censorship, where government allies acquire media outlets. And this is happening on both sides of the equation right now. We're seeing Democratic allies acquire media. We're seeing Republican allies who already own media becoming more extreme. And this is a sign that there is a bigger problem. But where it gets really concerning is where censorship laws are introduced, where the fake news is outlawed, even though it may not in fact be the fake news. And it becomes especially concerning when critical voices are sidelined or punished. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but it could. And if it does, we need to pay attention. The punishment of critics, the punishment of opposition is the sign that Americans need to come together as one. And if they don't, it could be catastrophic. And we need to make sure that there isn't electoral changes. The rules that were used to elect the current government need to be the rules used to elect the next government and the government after that and every government after. If the rules are changed to benefit the incumbents, that's a scary proposition. If opponents are banned or harassed, that is a scary proposition. And if election monitoring is rejected or compromised, well, that is a scary thing. And the second that political violence or intimidation becomes the norm, that is when we need to fight back. If protesters are met with force or legal threats, opposition leaders are jailed or harassed, or violence becomes the tool of governance, this is a sign that the nation needs to come together to ensure that democracy remains. Because when the opposition can no longer win, you no longer have a democracy. The people are no longer in control. And while you may think that's a good thing now, in practice, it definitely will not be. There's not a single authoritarian government on the planet that has ever ruled fairly or properly. And even though elections still might be held, if they're not competitive, they're useless. They're essentially propaganda. And if the media, the courts, and funding are stacked against the opposition, then it's not a real election either. And when regime change becomes impossible, that means the people are no longer in control. And you have lost your freedom. And you've probably lost your freedom without even realizing it, because democracies erode from within. And when the political system collapses, the economic system isn't far behind, which is why checks and balances, strong institutions, and vigilance are so important. Because if you aren't paying attention, we could very well lose our democracy. And if we lose our democracy, well, guess what? We're just going to be the next superpower that fails. And by the way, if you want to see what always happens before a superpower fails, make sure you check out this video right here.